anytime you're tightening like this, there's just the risk that there's a lot of like downside risk to the economy. And for the housing market, the thing I'm really worried about, and stuff that is really hard to model and really difficult to think about, especially in a macro kind of model, is things like all of a sudden you hit your trigger rate and your payment goes up a lot. And what happens when we have people resetting at much higher payments at a time when we're also experiencing a real negative economic shock, meaning unemployment rates rising. What does that mean for like household financial vulnerability? And that's where you get more negative consequences for prices.
Welcome to the Tom Storey Show with Steve Karrasch and Tom Storey, where we discuss everything real estate or whatever else is on our minds.
Welcome back to another episode of the Tom Storey Show. Just before I introduce this week's guest, who is we have a big guest. We're very excited to announce to you who it is. I just want to remind everybody, if you've been watching on YouTube and you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. And if you're listening on all the audio platforms, we've been getting a few ratings recently where people are saying that they would listen every week, but they haven't actually told us, and me and Steve really appreciate that. So if you're finding any value at all and you want to leave us a review, we would appreciate that. Also, a little public service announcement for anyone listening to this podcast that lives in the city of Toronto. As Steve knows and Brendon knows, who I'm about to introduce, Ontario, Toronto kind of copies what BC does, but 2 years later. So we have a new vacant home tax, which is coming into place in 2023. However, it is based on what your property was in 2022. So the online portal is now open. You can declare that your property was either rented out, lived in as your principal residence. There's a bunch of exemptions as well. Your deadline is February the 3rd, 2023. So to collect all this millions of data, we've given us 2.5 months. But you have to declare. If you do not declare, they will assume that your property is vacant. So there's my PSA just as we're getting started here. I'm thrilled to announce our guest today. He's someone that I know Steve watches very, very closely, not in a weird way. Well, maybe we'll find out. Brendon Ogmundson is the Chief Economist for the BC Real Estate Association. He holds an MA in Economics from the Simon Fraser University and is a CFA chart holder. Brendon specializes in housing market analysis and macroeconomic forecasting, is a member of the BC Ministry of Finance's Economic Forecast Council. He was also recently named, not a big deal, one of the most influential economists in BC by Business in Vancouver. Brendon, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So we got a lot to talk about. It's been a crazy year. And I got a really serious question to start. When you ask kids what they want to be when they grow up, they say firefighter, airplane, pilot. Not many of them say economist. But what I will say, these last 2 years, and maybe it's just the world me and Steve live in, like as an economist, are you starting to feel a little bit like a rock star? Because people really want to know what you're saying these days. It's not just boring anymore, right?
Yeah, I don't think economists ever feel like rock stars necessarily. But yeah, it's certainly, everyone always wants to talk to economists when things are going really poorly, I think, is when we're most valuable. Is like people want to like, please tell us something good is going to happen, or please explain what's going on in the world. So if we can provide any value whatsoever. As a kid, my kind of trajectory to become an economist, I'm going to date myself a lot now. Do you remember the show Family Ties?
Of course. Tom has no idea what that is.
I know
Tom's like, I don't know.
I haven't watched it. I've heard of it.
I was a big Family Ties fan. On that show, Michael J. Fox plays a character who's like, I'm not conservative at all, but he was a very conservative teenager who was very interested in economics and banking and stuff. So that was like what got me started down the line of thinking about, getting involved in financial markets and economics as a kid. So that's my origin story.
That's
it's not
your
that
origin
exciting.
story.
I didn't get bit by a radioactive economist or anything.
Now, when you go to the functions within your industry and you talk to all of your peers, like I've watched some of your stuff leading up to this because Steve introduced me to you. The economist that I'm most familiar with in my neck of the woods is Benjamin Tal because he speaks at a lot of the conferences.
Sure.
Both you and him are really like fun guys to talk to. When you're saying things, I can understand what you're saying. How have you taken something so complicated and is it because of the people you're talking to with the public and the real estate boards that you have to break it down for us to be like, hey guys, here's what's actually happening?
I've been through enough really boring economics presentations to know, and I think a lot of it's just knowing your audience. So some of it is like, as a younger economist, when you first are presenting things, you really just want to prove to the audience that you're really smart, right? And so like, oh, here I went to school for this, and here's some very complicated things. And then you get feedback from the audience, usually like, we don't like this. This is really boring. So I've been doing it for over a decade just to like, how can I make this more interesting? And also, if I have to say this stuff 50 times a year, it has to be fun for me. Otherwise, I get really bored too. So that's a big part of it. It's just like, how can we explain this so it makes sense to people? Most important. Second is maybe let's just have some fun doing it, because otherwise it can be so dry and so boring. And I think the only way to really communicate and connect with the audience is sometimes I find like when I'm doing presentations and I have a lot of references, like memes and whatever. And sometimes like, are you just waiting for the next one? Like, do you care about this chart of like, yield curves, or are you just waiting for like the next joke? But the feedback I've got is always like, no, it like helps us pay attention, basically, I think. So I don't know. I find it's useful. It's useful for me. It's fun for me. I've got good feedback. So I don't know. The economics doesn't have to be dry and boring.
Yeah, it could be fun. And I think now, as we're going through what we're going through as a country, the whole world's kind of going through this in their own way. I think like the average consumer at home needs to know a few basic things where, I was even talking with colleagues in my office. So I've been selling real estate for just 9.5 years now. I think Steve's 15 years, Steve?
Coming up on 15.
Coming up on 15. But neither of us, other than little blips in the market, have really seen things change this quickly. And really, unless you're a real estate agent or economist or anyone that's been doing it for 25 years, you really haven't seen this. So if I'm someone listening to this, so our audience is kind of split between homeowners and real estate agents and mortgage brokers. That's kind of like who listens to this podcast. So 2-part question. For a homeowner right now, what would you say is the most important thing they would need to know about what's actually happening right now? And then for a business owner, whether it's a real estate agent or a mortgage broker, same question for them.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it is the same story. Everything in the Canadian housing market right now is about interest rates. So, we were forecasting a decent year in BC this year because, but we thought home sales would come down about 15 or 20% because we set records last year. Instead, we're down, a lot more than that because we've had a Bank of Canada that is, has been raising interest rates at its sort of high, fastest pace since the early 90s. No one thought that was going to happen at the start of this year. And so for realtors, I think the biggest thing is understanding the interplay of the Bank of Canada's monetary policy and mortgage rates, because sometimes it's not necessarily intuitive. We can get situations like right now, or what might be happening next few months, rather, where the Bank of Canada's around probably at the end of its tightening cycle, but still raising rates. So variable rates are going up. But there's a really good chance that fixed rates might be coming down.
Yeah.
So it's very strange, and it happens pretty often where variable rates going up, Bank of Canada overnight rates going up, but 5-year fixed rates are really about expectations of financial markets. And so what we've seen over the past month is financial markets grasping for the direction of the economy, the direction of the Bank of Canada over the next 5 years. And what we're seeing is ultimately a downward trend in 5-year bond yields.
Yep.
So bond yields are, a proxy for funding costs for banks, for bank mortgages. When they're falling, you tend to see 5-year fixed rate mortgages coming down as well. I forget where I was going with this, but for the real estate sector, I think just understanding we haven't been through a real monetary policy cycle. Not really. Like in 2018, the Bank of Canada was raising rates, didn't get very far. They think their neutral rates between 2 and 3%. We only got to 1.75. We haven't been through this kind of tightening cycle in a really long time. And I think we've kind of forgotten about how monetary policy works, how long it takes. Yeah. So a lot of what I'm doing now is kind of educating, like, here's why the Bank of Canada is raising rates. They're legally mandated to keep inflation at a 2% target. Inflation's 7% now. They need to bring inflation down. It takes about a year for Bank of Canada, increases in the Bank of Canada's overnight rate to impact growth and inflation. So all this work they're doing now, we're not going to see until 2023. And so understand that interplay, both of why the Bank of Canada is doing what it's doing, because I think it can be pretty opaque to a lot of people who don't have, like, why do they keep raising rates? Why are they doing this? Inflation's still really high. It's not having any effect. So just understanding there's like a 6-quarter lag between rate hikes and inflation. And then what does that mean for the next year? Growth is going to be slowing down. What does that mean for the housing market? Understanding how the housing cycle relates to the overall business cycle. So what we always see is that housing leads the business cycle. So if you're a realtor right now, you're already experiencing a recession that's probably going to happen in 2023. We've seen home sales falling for several months, and that's the pattern we always see before a recession, is that home sales come down really fast. They tend to bottom out about 2 to 3 months into a recession. So once a recession actually starts in the wider economy, then the housing market tends to start recovering and leads the economy in that recovery. We usually have home sales up in BC anyway, up 30 to 40% the year after the start of a recession. So, when you're a realtor and you're thinking, oh my God, like the housing market's already so in such bad shape, and now we're going to be in a recession in 2023. Usually, though, housing experiences a recession first, and then so what we expect is that as long as inflation's coming down and the Bank of Canada can react the way it normally does and lower rates by the end of next year, we'll actually have a pretty strong recovery if things go the way they normally go. So I don't know if I answered either question,
No,
but
I
I
think
certainly
you did.
talked for a long time.
Well, you said whatever you said sounded great.
Okay, so we are a little bit of nerds on this. So like Tom and I will probably just sit here like, just keep talking about this stuff because we love it. So we're not going to stop you at all.
Okay, great. I'll just monologue about like bank funding costs and swap rates then.
I've got a question about the Bank of Canada, and it's a kind of loaded question, but I want your honest opinion on it. So, has the Bank of Canada lost the trust of Canadians because they were so clear in the fact? And again, it's not their fault necessarily that the world did what it did, but they said basically, listen, you guys are safe. Go do what you need to do. We're going to stay relatively low till the end of next year, the end of 2023. And now what's happening? And if you listen to them then and you're getting burned now, why would you listen to them in the future? So your opinion on just like, has their trust fallen with just citizens of Canada?
So from the Bank of Canada's perspective, they certainly did communicate that they were going to keep. So like banks use what's called forward guidance, especially when the overnight rate's at the zero lower bound. They can't lower rates anymore, and they have to find ways to lower long-term rates and keep them low. So they do things like either quantitative easing, where they're going out and buying bonds and forcing yields down, or they do things like forward guidance. So if you think about, this is about to get extremely nerdy, so we're going to might lose some people. But so if you think about, say, the 5-year bond yield, which is very important for the mortgage market, you can decompose that 5-year bond yield into two things. You've got a term premium for just the risk you're taking for locking up your money over 5 years. And then most of that 5-year bond yield is just the expectations for what the Bank of Canada is going to do. So you can think of like, say the yield's 3%, and the expectations component of that is 2.8%, and you have a 20 basis point premium. Just making up numbers. So what the bank with that forward guidance is trying to do is say, keep your expectations over the next few years at this very low rate, and that will keep bond yields low. So that was part of their overall idea to stimulate growth in an economy that was dealing with a lot of uncertainty and a pandemic that, especially back in 2021, when I think we made those comments, or end of 2020, really needing with a ton of uncertainty about when we're going to have vaccinations, how effective they were going to be, what new mutations of a virus there might be, lockdowns, all those sorts of things. So that's the environment they were dealing with, and they were thinking we need to keep rates low. Now, the monetary policy is always, even with forward guidance, always has a caveat. So this is where you need to read the fine print. they're legally mandated to keep inflation at 2% over a 8-quarter horizon, medium-term horizon. And the caveat to that statement is, unless basically conditions radically change. So the problem is on the communication side. If you're me and you know a fair amount about monetary policy and central banking, you're like, yeah, but if inflation's 8%, they're probably going to start raising rates, right?
Right.
Now, that was low probability. Maybe their forecast certainly didn't have, no one's forecast really had inflation getting out of control like that. I think when you have a audience, though, and this is again about know your audience, if you're going to say that, the headline is going to be Bank of Canada says go borrow at a variable rate mortgage, and that's what people do because they certainly didn't read the speech, and they certainly didn't maybe even read most of the article, or
no, they read the headline.
They read the headline like everyone else. So I think it's if you're going to say something like that, you really need to also communicate the risk and here is how things could change. So whether they've lost credibility, I don't think so, but it's certainly from a communications perspective, I think maybe it was a bit of they could have been clearer perhaps.
Can you explain to me, and I've had clients ask me this when I talk to them about why the rates are raising and how we have to keep inflation at 2%. Who decided 2%? When was that decided? Why is it exactly 2%? Why can't it be 3.5%? Can you explain that to me?
So funny. I've got this question. So I've been doing this again for about, I'm not just vamping here. I have an answer. I've been doing this for a long time. I've never, in the 10 years up to like the last 2 months, had a question about the inflation target and like, why can't we have a 4% inflation target? And then I've got that question like so many times over the past several weeks. So essentially, the 2% inflation is somewhat arbitrary in that it's a rate that's high enough that say we want to target zero inflation, right? There's kind of an error around that. There's a measurement error. So there's a possibility that I think it is actually overestimated sometimes on inflation. So there's a potential that if say we target zero, we would actually be in a deflationary environment. And you don't want that. It's very damaging to the economy. So you want sort of enough inflation that like you can have because and this is again a little bit wonky because wages are very sticky. You want enough inflation sort of that real wages can kind of decline. Now I'm trying to think of the macro of this. You sort of want enough wage adjustment that like hiring can still happen and you're not anyway. I won't get too into that into sticky wages. Anyway, so it was decided because central banking and monetary policy was kind of a mess all through the 70s and 80s with banks trying to target the money supply, all of this thing. And you had inflation completely out of control because it's very hard to measure those things, and the correlation between the two wasn't necessarily, or the causation wasn't that solid. And then you had the advent of inflation targeting by the New Zealand central bank in the early 90s, adopted by the Bank of Canada. We sort of decided, I think Ben Bernanke had a lot of really great research on inflation targeting, and it sort of decided 2% is kind of enough inflation that you're not going to distort kind of labor markets and the economy, but you're not also going to risk a deflationary spiral. It's not too high either, and we thought that there wasn't a lot of risk at a 2% inflation rate that we would be continually hitting the zero lower bound either.
Right.
That turned out we had about 30 years of pretty strong, like pretty stable price, inflation, like it just oscillated around 2%. We had what was called the Great Moderation, where interest rates came down over, from the really high levels of the 80s and 90s to very low levels throughout the 90s and 2000s. Growth and inflation weren't as volatile as they had been. So with this really kind of golden age up until it wasn't in the financial crisis. And that's when we started having real problems with the zero lower bound, because if inflation's 2% and your kind of neutral rate's 2%, you've got a 4% nominal rate, and it doesn't take a whole lot of cuts to get to zero pretty fast, right? So the idea of maybe we should increase the inflation target to 3 to 4% has some like pretty strong grounding in macroeconomics. And there's some really brilliant people like Olivier Blanchard, who's one of my favorite economists, French economist, who would argue for a 4% inflation target. The issue then, if you have a 4% inflation target, that means you probably have something like a 6 or 7% neutral nominal rate. Right.
Right.
I don't think we like 4.25% right now. So that's the downside. You're going to have much higher nominal rates. You're going to have a lot more with that much higher neutral rate. You have a lot more ammunition to fight recessions because you can go all the way, 700 basis points down at the expense of very high borrowing costs. And I think if you've probably noticed, people don't like inflation very much. So you can imagine, and there is, we do have an independent central bank, but they get their mandate from the government. So if we had a government, you can imagine, especially in the current political environment in Canada, if we had a Liberal government saying, we're actually going to mandate now the Bank of Canada target inflation at 4%. I don't think that's an election winner in the current environment. Even if the macro is really strong on it, and there's lots of theoretical underpinnings, I think you have to place the theory inside the real world sometimes, and that just couldn't happen.
Do you think that the Bank of Canada went too far, perfectly hit it so far, or haven't gone far enough?
I don't think we'll know. My bias right now is they probably have over tightened, but it depends on what their goals are, right? It seems like they're not going to say this, but in Bank of Canada speak, I guess maybe they expect the economy to stall from basically the fourth quarter through the first half of 2023. Mm-hmm. That's essentially saying we think there's going to be a recession in Canada, and they're causing that recession through their rate increases. So I think their goal is to cause a shallow recession in 2023 to get inflation back down to normal, just the way that relationship usually works. So I think it really kind of depends on if you think that level of tightening and that level of reduction in demand was necessary to bring inflation back to 2%. When we run our own models and have a 4.25% overnight rate and 4.5%, I think, by the first quarter, we get a short and shallowish recession in the first 2 quarters of the year. We get inflation coming back. So it works. It works in a model. It should, if things go according to model, which we all know they always do. Then we should have a softish landing, and that's probably what they're seeing too. The dynamics of our much, much, much smaller, less sophisticated macroeconomic forecasting model is very similar to the Bank of Canada's in terms of how rates impact growth and inflation. So you could get a softish landing where unemployment rate doesn't go up too much. You don't have too much, and then we have a recovery and rates come back down to neutral. But there's always the risk that you've over tightened. There's always the risk that you're tightening and then we get hit by some other shock that no one saw coming and the recession's much worse. So I think it's very difficult. There's not it's hard to calibrate these things, and anytime you're tightening like this, there's just the risk that there's a lot of downside risk to the economy. And for the housing market, the thing I'm really worried about, and stuff that is really hard to model and really difficult to think about, especially in a macro kind of model, is things like people hitting trigger rates. Yeah. So these sort of non-linearities where all of a sudden you hit your trigger rate and your payment goes up a lot, level shifts. And what happens when we have people resetting at much higher payments at a time when we're also experiencing a real negative economic shock, meaning unemployment rates rising. What does that mean for household financial vulnerability? And what does that mean then for a lot of more desperate supply coming on the market? And that's where you get more negative consequences for prices.
You got
You
got ahead of me on my next question.
Sure.
So first, very serious question here. Have you canceled your Disney Plus yet?
This episode of the Tom Storey Show is brought to you by the YouTube for Real Estate video course. Are you interested in creating an engaging, value-driven YouTube channel to help educate your client base on real estate in your market, as well as introduce a new revenue stream to your business? Perhaps you've already created a YouTube channel, but are struggling to gain viewership and the subscribers you are looking for. The YouTube for Real Estate course will provide you with proven tips and strategies on how to create and cultivate an engaging YouTube channel, as well as how to optimize your channel, resulting in higher viewership, subscribers, and yes, deals. But that's not it. I implemented YouTube in my business in early 2021, and it has easily been the best marketing source for meeting new clients that I have ever had in my business, period. Better than expensive geo-farming, internet marketing, and open houses combined. And now it even rivals my repeat and referral business. If you would like to learn all the tips and tricks for meeting new clients using YouTube, simply go to Video Course Login or click the link in the description below and sign up for the YouTube for Real Estate course today. And learn a year's worth of my painstaking research of learning how to use YouTube for real estate in just a few hours by taking the YouTube for Real Estate course. So go to videocourselogin.com right now and use the promo code TOMSHOW at checkout. Again, that's videocourselogin.com or simply use the link below.
Have you canceled your Disney Plus yet?
No, I mean there's so many great shows on it. If you like Star Wars, how can you cancel Disney Plus?
Okay.
It's pretty cheap, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't
Is
know.
it one of the cheaper ones? Yeah.
I think all of them are like giving you an option with ads now, so you can cut your costs in half.
Oh, sure.
But here's the real question. From your perspective and looking at the numbers and having conversations with other economists and everything that you do on a daily basis, like, are you worried about the average Canadian right now? Because there's the people that had the adjustable variables that have already felt it and are surviving so far. Like, I personally haven't seen like a ton of distressed sales in my market. I haven't seen it yet. Maybe it's coming. Then you've got the people like, I just got that letter in the mail. My cottage just went up $500 a month. I hit my trigger rate. Okay. And it's not great. Like, it sucks. I can cover it, but it sucks. And then you got the people that had the fixed rate at 3%, 2.5%, whatever, that have 1 year left. And if rates don't come down by the end of next year, it's like, bam, 5.5% or wherever they're at that point. So based on all of that and the conversations you're having, like, are you worried that maybe they went so far that now people are going to be in really tough spots?
Yeah, that's the risk that we're worrying about. It's not like our baseline, but this is sort of, you can kind of see how those risks shape up. Like, especially if you have a shock to the unemployment rate, to unemployment. People are losing jobs, to put it more clearly. If people are losing their jobs at the same time as they're getting a $500 increase on their mortgage, that's going to cause a lot of desperation and a lot of listings coming on the market that need to go really fast, and that's how you get bigger price adjustments or downward price adjustments. So, I'm worried about it, but again, like you said, we're not seeing it yet. Like, the media and like headlines tend to get way ahead of the data. So like, most of the economic data is still pretty good, like as it always is before a recession, but like, we're not seeing a ton of softness yet. And you see this in the US too, where they have the same headlines and same kind of like everyone forecasts a recession next year. But like, still really strong job growth, still really, really low unemployment rate. So even in our models for BC, we have the unemployment rate going up to 6% from 4 point. It's almost at a record low right now. It's 4.4, all-time low. I think it's like 3.9 or 4.2. So we're really, really low unemployment rate. If it goes up to 6, I mean, it was 14% during the pandemic. So if it goes up to 6, like, it's bad. It's always bad when people lose their jobs, but we're not expecting even like a financial crisis situation where we went from 4 to 8 in like a couple months. Yeah, I've been something that we could handle. Yeah,
I've been too excited, but I've been asking too many questions. Steve, you've been patiently waiting. I know you're excited. So let's go. What do you got?
Can I add one more thing too?
Please.
on the cost thing? So I hate to call it a silver lining, or there are no positives for the pandemic, but like, one thing that did happen was there was an enormous amount of forced savings. So in the 8 quarters of the pandemic, Canadian households saved more in those 8 quarters than they had in the previous 7 years combined. It's like $340 billion. And as of 2021, households with debt had 5 times their average monthly expenditures in just liquid savings. In 2019, they had 1 month. So like in some ways, we're in very good shape to absorb these costs because of, the pandemic essentially. And so this like path dependency, how if this had all had happened in 2019, we would be in much worse shape than we are in 2022.
Well
going
put.
into 2020.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have. Well, I've got 3 notes that I want to address because I've never been able to ask somebody that's as smart as you, Brendon, to answer or at least comment on these things. And that is the fact that this is on YouTube, which will attract a certain amount of the conspiracy nuts, and I'm not down that train at all. And then our audio side is more real estate agents. But the one thing that constantly gets brought up about inflation is the quote unquote basket of goods. And everybody seems to think that the Bank of Canada is just there to try and tweak the numbers to tell the story that they want to tell. For instance, I was listening to a guy say, well, how come the basket of goods is so much different than it was in the 1970s? My thought is, well, life is a lot different than it was in the 1970s. And I would hope that the Bank of Canada would also try to improve their calculations from the 70s, and we're not just doing things the way they were previously. So any comments or about that and how inflation is calculated? Because I think there's a lot of people out there that think the government's trying to pull one over their eyes when they're not, or the Bank of Canada anyway, is trying to pull one over.
Yeah, so for those people, I would suggest maybe you can I don't know if they do this, book a tour to go hang out with some of the people that put together the CPI at Stats Canada. You'll find that they're just like super nerdy professionals who take this very seriously and have no interest in skewing anything. They're just economists and statisticians that are trying to do their job. And there's some pretty rigid standards they have to follow. And a lot of those are like internationally set, sort of agreements on how we should measure these things. So, that's why I always get, these conspiracy theories things are ridiculous, especially if you know some of these people. You're like, oh, like that guy is part of a grand conspiracy? Like, I don't think so. Anyway, so that's ridiculous. You can kind of, brush that away without too much analysis. Like the basket of goods changes over time because what we spend money on changes over time. That's what CPI is trying to measure, is like, what do average Canadians spend their money on? Now, no one is the average Canadian, right? No one spends, well, I spend 2% of my, 4% of my paycheck goes to gasoline and 30% goes to shelter services. Like, for someone like me, I've got two teenage boys. I have, a mortgage. I whatever. Like, my basket of goods is very different from someone else's. From like a single person living in an apartment, right? That doesn't need a car and doesn't buying groceries for two teenagers who eat everything in the house. So like my basket's very different than the average basket. So what we're trying to measure is just like, what does the average Canadian spend on, and how is that changing over time, right? And so, people have gotten very interested in how that works. 30% of CPI is shelter, and if you kind of look under the hood on how we measure shelter, it's very complicated. A lot of, I think some statistical agencies don't even try to measure things like ownership housing, because it's like, how do you measure an asset? Is this really, we have to kind of model the service that you get from your house, which is kind of like, well, if I had to rent it, what would that be? And it gets very complicated. Even measuring rent is hard, because you have, not everyone gets their rent reset every month, right? So you have a market rent that's going to be a little different from the CPI rent. So it's going to take a while for CPI to catch up, because it's sort of like, well, what share are renewing? And even the rental side is put together a little differently now, where they try and like adjust for square footage and number of bedrooms and all that kind of stuff. So, it's a complicated exercise. It's not perfect, but it should be, it's pretty close. And even when, things like, there used to be I think still maybe this billion price project, I think it's called, where they basically just scraped prices off the internet. So just, from Amazon, wherever, just like trying to get inflation from just collecting as much price data as possible. And it matched CPI pretty well. So it's not like, inflation is wildly out of control. The most hilarious thing is in the United States, they had this thing called shadow stats, where it was this conspiracy theory about how inflation was actually like several points higher. And the most hilarious thing is, so they're claiming inflation is actually extremely high, but their own prices for the subscription hadn't changed in like 10 years, which I thought was funny. Like, if you believe inflation's credit, your prices should be much higher. But anyway.
Yeah. That's actually, I think, one of the sites or organizations that's cited in a lot of those comments.
Sure.
The next thing I had for you, which is probably I don't know, it's going to not be an easy topic either, is right now in the news cycle is the kind of cocky response from Justin Trudeau talking about servicing government debt. And he was talking about record lows, and he almost laughed at the reporter when he was like, well, we're at record low for interest rates. My concern around the future next year of the country is, and I'm not at all smart enough to even comment on this, but this government debt that seems to be double what we've spent in history over the last 2 years, how does that get paid? How much of that should be our massive concern? We all know that it's not going to get paid back, and we're not going to pay off our debt, but how do we service the debt?
Yeah, and the servicing is more important than paying back. I mean, the government, unlike you or I, is an essentially infinitely lived individual, right? So there's no one's coming to the government of Canada and demanding full payment of all of our debt right away. So it's really like, what are the flows, more importantly, in the stock of debt? And so we're talking about those flows. What are our interest costs as share of GDP? What are our interest costs as a share of government revenues, that kind of thing? And they're obviously higher, but they're not even where they were in like fiscal crisis 1990s, right? So with the bank, and even right now with yields coming down, the government of Canada can borrow it for 5 years at under 3%. They can borrow it 10 years for under 3%. So it's really short-term debt that's really expensive right now, and the bank doesn't borrow in the treasury market that as much as they borrow longer term to finance all their expenditures. So it's a concern. I mean, the more we spend on interest costs, the less we can spend on other things, and maybe that means there needs to be some tightening, whether higher taxes or lower spending in other places. But it's not a concern in the way that it was a concern in the 90s when we had real fiscal crisis, because we actually were in pretty good fiscal shape heading into a pandemic. And there's a good reason why we've built up the debt we built up over the past 2 years. Like, if we hadn't, we'd be in really, really bad shape right now, right? So one of the reasons why we had employment recover within a year is because we had an enormous amount of stimulus. If we hadn't have done that, usually you don't see, from a recession, especially as deep as we had, normally you don't see employment recover after a recession for a few years. Like in BC, I think after the financial crisis, it took 5 years to get back to the pre-recession level of employment. So we had an incredible recovery. It was really expensive. We were paying the costs for it now, both in inflation and in the ultimate debt servicing. But no one's talking about, no one serious is talking about the government of Canada being anything close to a fiscal crisis or something.
I got one more, but I'm going to save it for later because I want Tom back in here.
All right. Here's my my new thing that we do in the podcast called Ask an Economist. We have 3 rapid fire questions. Okay.
Is this brand new?
I just made it up in the last 10 seconds.
You're also the only economist. So.
Yeah, you're the only one that's been here. When will rates drop from the Bank of Canada?
So again, in our models, which of course are always right, we have rates coming down in the end of the third quarter. So third quarter ish. If you look at financial market expectations, so traders betting billions of dollars on what they expect the policy rate to do over the next year, that's about, I think we see rates coming down in September in those expectations. So which is all really depends on in our model, of course, you have a normal, our little computer Bank of Canada sees growth that's negative and inflation coming back to its target, sees that interest rates are set well above their neutral rate and says, well, all the conditions match for us to start lowering rates. Let's lower rates back to neutral, which is between 2 and 3%. So if that's the way things go, and that's the way all models work, we should see rates coming down. And if even it almost has to. So if like right now the Bank of Canada, if you believe the Bank of Canada or the Bank of Canada believes itself that its neutral rate is between 2 and 3%, there's no reason, if we're in an economy that is slowing substantially and if with inflation back on a trajectory to 2%, there's no reason for them to be slamming on the brakes as hard as they are. So then they want rates to be neutral to keep, inflation at 2%. And that itself means a reduction of their overnight rate from wherever they end up, 4.25, 4.5, down to at least 3%. Right. So even a normal economy would have rates lower than now. If we have an economy that is in recession and if we have inflation that's undershooting its target, then rates would have to come down even more.
This episode of the Tom Storey Show is brought to you by the Storey team at LePage Signature in Toronto, Ontario. The Storey team focuses on satisfying all of their clients' wants and needs when either buying or selling real estate in the GTA. But don't take my word for it. They have way over 100 5-star reviews on Google from clients singing their praises after amazing home purchases and sales. From downtown Toronto condos to semis to detached homes, whatever your needs, Tom and his team promise to provide an educated, honest, and transparent approach to helping all of their clients achieve their financial and personal goals through real estate. So there is no need to search bus benches or newspaper ads anymore to find the right agent for you. Just visit www.storeyteam.ca to book a call with the Storey team today. That's StoreyTeam.ca. That's storeyteam.ca. This communication is not intended to cause or induce breach of any existing agency agreement.
In that first drop that we could potentially see, is it going to be like a little teaser, 25, maybe 50? Like they're not going to drop one, are they? Like they've been going up?
No, not absent some major shock, right? I would guess that they'll like titrate down 25 basis points until we get over the course of over a year or so, and that's 100 basis points. We'll kind of get back to around 3 by the end of 2024 would be my guess. But again, everything depends on inflation. Like if inflation's 6% in the third quarter of next year, even if the economy is kind of stalling, it's going to be really hard for them to cut rates. So a lot depends on the trajectory of inflation, core inflation especially.
Are you worried that the inflation, they could do something similar? And I wasn't around for this. I was born, but not around for it. But in the early 80s, my understanding is they cut it too quickly and they turned back and then inflation doubled from that point. And then they had to
I actually was there because I'm 75 years old. I just look amazing. I mean, there's the risk. There's always it's not so much of a science. It's more of a science now. Monetary policy is more of a science now than it was in the 80s when they had absolutely no idea what they were doing. You can tell from the volatility of inflation. And then in the 80s, they had to tighten really hard, right? And so in the early 80s, they ended up, mortgage rates were 20% or 21. All you have to do is ask any baby boomer about interest rates, and they'll tell you that their first mortgage rate was 22% or something. So they, I think their monetary policy is probably too loose because they were experimenting with targeting different money supply measures and letting interest rates fluctuate. And then they had to tighten very, very hard in the early mid 80s. So there are always going to be mistakes on monetary policy. We might be seeing a mistake in monetary policy right now. Maybe they're over tightening. So they're always going to. Again, it's not an exact science. My guess would be, because we're playing around just at the margins, right? Like 4.25 is not a super high overnight rate. It's what used to be pretty normal in the early 2000s. So coming back down from that to 3, it's not going to cause in your. So think about it this way: if you just average the types of models that people use, there's actually a really cool website where you can see this. 100 basis point shock to rates brings inflation down. Increase in rates brings inflation down about 20 to 25 basis points at its peak impact in a year. So it's not super powerful, right? So it's really about calibrated inflation more so than like you have to have so a lot of what we're seeing right now, inflation's 500 basis points higher than it needs to be. With 400 basis points of tightening, we can get about, quick math, about a point of inflation reduction at its peak. A lot of the rest of inflation coming down is just arithmetic, right? Like things aren't going up as fast as they used to. So like gas prices being where they are now. So in BC, they're like $1.50. They were $2.40 or something at one point. Yeah. So when we get to whenever that was, it was like October. When we get to October 2023, that's a big change in gas prices. And that alone is going to be dragging inflation down. So if you just think if gas prices stay where they are right now, it'll start to drag inflation lower by the first quarter of 2023. So we're going to have this reversal of what, we had these huge increases, huge contributions of inflation to inflation from gas prices. Now it's going to go the other way. And there's a whole bunch of categories like that. So there's just this natural arithmetic where, we're not seeing this persistent price increases that, we're probably going to get 200 or 300 basis points of inflation reduction just because, gas prices are not as high as they were and food prices aren't growing as fast as they were, right? So a lot of what we're going to see is just that. And then you also have that pull from higher rates of, 100 basis points or whatever. So I don't even remember where we started, but yeah. So I think the risk to lowering rates too fast is probably pretty low. I think what we've maybe learned about fiscal and monetary policy is that if you want inflation, fiscal policy is the way to go. And especially like giving people money is the way to go. We had a really hard time after the financial crisis getting back to just 2% inflation. If you remember how bad the recovery how slow the recovery following the financial crisis was. And that was with rates still very, very low. And it's that we just couldn't generate inflation. It was under 2% for a really long time because we also had all this like pivot to austerity and like governments were like, oh, we've racked up too much debt during the financial crisis. And now we got to really cut back. And we had a very slow recovery and we had a very hard time getting inflation back to its target. In the pandemic response, we have the exact opposite. We're like, let's just give all of the money out and see what happens. Essentially, it's like a pretty grand experiment. And it turns out helicopter dropping money to people's bank accounts at a time when they can't spend money on services results in a lot of goods inflation, right? I give the example I used to give was, think about, during the pandemic, if gyms were closed, you had to then buy gym equipment, and gym equipment needs to be put together and put in a container and shipped all over the world. So like instead of spending on services, you took all that services spending, you took the $30 a month or whatever it cost to go to a gym that you weren't going to, and then you bought a Peloton that sat in your basement and collected laundry or whatever, right? Like
it's like you're describing Steve.
There is no laundry on that thing behind me right now.
Shifted spending, you spent from one thing you didn't use to another thing. But like that happened in all sorts of sectors where just money couldn't be spent in one. So we had to spend it all in the goods sector. Goods prices went way up. We had all kinds of supply chain problems because at the same time that was happening, you had tons of shutdowns due to COVID. Factories couldn't produce nearly as much to meet that demand. So I think we learned a lot about like how to really generate inflation, and maybe we'll learn from that. Maybe we won't, but it's going to be interesting if we have a recession in 2023, if governments are going to be really gun shy to use fiscal policy because it is pretty inflationary. We've learned, especially in some circumstances, and in that amount.
If you bought a property tomorrow, would you take a variable? Would you take a 1-year fixed, a 2-year fixed? What would you personally do for your situation? Not advice for anyone else, just for you.
This is not financial advice.
No.
Right. This is not financial advice. I've always taken out fixed rates just because I like just certainty. most economists I think are pretty risk averse. So I would probably take out a fixed rate, but
But a 5-year?
I would look really hard at a variable rate simply because we know that if again, and this can always change, but if the Bank of Canada is telling you the rate we would like our overnight rate to be at is between 2 and 3%, and right now it's 4.25. Eventually, it's going to come down to that neutral rate. That's what the Bank of Canada wants, right? If inflation's at 2%, then rates should be between 2 and 3.
Gotcha. Now let's fast forward here. Your job is going to become even more fun for the first 4 months of next year, because as the chief economist for the BC Real Estate Association, you're going to be quoted in the reports that come out. Because right now it doesn't look so bad year over year, but January, February, March is going to look bad. So have you already thought about how you're going to write that, what you're going to have to write, the blurb for that? Because it's not going to be pretty.
No, it's not, especially in some markets like Surrey or Langley or Abbotsford, where prices are down, or going to be down like 25% year over year. I keep trying to plant the idea, like with media, even if prices don't change at all month over month for the next 6 months, prices are going to be down 25% year over year. It's a really hard thing to message. I find it's really hard even with our forecast, because we forecast annual prices. And so for like the Fraser Valley, annual prices are going to be up 10% in 2022, right? They started the year up 40% or something. But like year over year, like it's volume weighted. So if you have tons of volume at a really high price and way less volume at a lower price, the average is still going to be pretty high. And that's what we're dealing with. We talk about annual prices year over year. But that means 2023, even if nothing changes, prices are going to be down like 10%. So
yeah, we can already write these headlines. Like we know exactly what's going to be written for the first 4 months of next year.
Prices crashed in February. It's like, well, they actually came down over 6 months last year. Nothing actually changed in February. So yeah, I got to think about it, but it's not going to be fun at all. It's going to be a lot of it's going to be educating that sounds like excuses, which never sounds good. It's a really hard messaging thing because no one likes messaging that involves math, right? Like here's why this is happening. Here's just arithmetic of why this has happened.
That was actually one of the last videos, Tom, I put out on my channel was like minus 40%, because in, I think, February, I think Mission is going to show average price minus 40% in detached. Right. So it's like, be prepared, guys. This number is coming, even though those price drops are already here.
Already happened.
This is where the media is going to pick up on in February and March.
It's the same thing we get in CPI, where the year-over-year number is less relevant than the month-over-month right now. When you have large changes, then what's happening right now is a lot more important. But we've sort of trained ourselves to really think about year-over-year in everything, even if it's not necessarily relevant to what's actually occurring right now. It just tells you what happened over the past 12 months.
And doesn't year-over-year become irrelevant if things have changed this much? Like if the rates were the exact same year-over-year, like, okay, fine. But we've gone up 7 times. Like it's not the same comparison.
No, it's a very difficult messaging exercise that I'm not really looking forward to.
I saw something today from OSFI here in Ontario for the stress test that they said it's not going nowhere. That's a good decision, a bad decision. What's your thoughts on that?
When the stress test was announced in 2018, I thought it was pretty bad, pretty heavy-handed policy. I think as a risk management tool, and like risk management is all about like the 1 of 100 times you actually need that protection, and so maybe this time it worked. I do think a better stress test, and a stress test that worked pretty well during the pandemic, or once it was instituted, is just have a minimum, just have the rate be your contract rate or 5.25%. Like just get rid of the 200 basis point buffer. Like if your rate's higher than that qualifying rate, cool, qualify at 6 then. I don't know why we need to qualify people at 8.
And so many mortgage brokers were telling me like that period of time where the fixed rates were already almost at 5%, but variable was still at 3. It's like people were taking the variable, even though they probably shouldn't have, just because they qualified for more, and now they're getting hit. And again, that's your own decision. But it like the stress test, I think, did work, but then also made it very difficult for people because they had to take variable.
Yep. Yeah. Push people into that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There was a weird situation too, I think, before it was harmonized, where you could, I think, high ratio borrowers could qualify at a lower rate.
Yeah, it was silly.
Just like made no sense whatsoever. Yeah,
it's like you saved up to get to 20% down, but your rate is worse than the person putting 5% down.
Yeah, it was so stupid.
It's silly. Okay, I got a few other topics here I think are interesting. There's a foreign buyer ban finally coming into place. The only thing that all the political parties basically agreed on in the last election. Does this matter? No. Is this going to change anything?
So in BC, the share of foreign investors, so this doesn't include people who are married to permanent residents or anything, just pure non-resident purchases of real estate in BC in 2022 was about 0.5% or something. During the pandemic, it was effectively zero, and we had record sales. So if your hypothesis in January 2020 was that foreign investment and foreign capital are huge drivers of the market, I think we proved that hypothesis wrong. We don't usually get to have natural experiments in macro where you can just like turn off sectors of the economy and see what happens. But we had a pandemic, we had almost no immigration, we had almost no foreign investment, and we got record home sales and record prices. So seems pretty definitive in that situation that that's not the biggest cause of affordability in the housing market. And it's almost zero right now. It can go to zero without much of an impact, especially considering the very same time they're banning foreign investment or foreign buyers, they're also increasing immigration by, to 500,000 people a year for 3 years. So we have actually modeled this. We have this really cool policy model that we built over the past year where we can simulate all kinds of different supply side policies, speeding up construction, all that stuff, but also a bunch of demand side things, including what happens in an immigration shock. And it splits out, it has a demand kind of block of the model that splits out primary residence purchases and investors. So if we just have like this negative shock to investment, investor purchases, but also a big immigration shock, that I think the immigration shock is about the impact on sales is like 10 times the foreign buyer shock, right? So, or something like that. It's much higher. I think, depending on on like the average new immigrant family, I think in our model has a household size of like 3.5, and 50% of them purchase a home in the first 5 years, which is about what the data says. I think in the census it's 45% or something. And if you do that in BC with their usual share of immigration, I think you get about 15,000 extra sales over 3 years versus losing 2,000 sales or something over 2 years. So one way outweighs the other. It's like 7 times or whatever it is. So foreign buyer ban is good politics, because if you survey a public who's been told for the past decade that foreign investors are the biggest cause of why they can't buy a home, turns out they believe you, and when you poll them, they repeat back to you what you've been telling them for the last 10 years.
You know what the best one? The best thing here in Ontario was that Doug Ford just announced that our foreign buyer tax is going up to the highest in Canada at 25%, which
so 25% of zero.
And then like he just wanted that headline before they were banned for 2 years. Like, it's so silly. It's all just politics, right? Like,
speaking of useless policies, let's stack BC's cooling off period on top of that. Right? Like, it's going to do nothing. Yeah, so none of these things are going to do anything.
I think, and we wrote a paper all about this. I think at there's potential side effects of the cooling off period adding volatility to markets. So if you are in a really hot market and you can make all kinds of offers, right? You're essentially increasing demand on properties, because now I'm saying I'm going to offer on these 5 houses and I'm just going to use the cooling off for what, deep-pocketed buyers might do that in a really hot market where they don't want to get outbid. They're just going to be like, well, I'm just going to pull out of these 3 and pay the nominal fee to get the one I want. You're adding demand. Then you instead of maybe 5 offers, now you have 6 or 7 offers on each home, right? That just increases prices. On the downside, it means in a falling market, you're like, well, I made that offer, but now I'm pulling it. And we know that offers often, or home sales are often contingent on, if I'm going to buy this home, I need to sell mine first. Oh, you pulled out of my sale. Now I can't buy this one. And you get this domino effect on the downside. So I think it can add, and we told the government this, of course, I think it adds volatility around kind of extreme situations.
Were you guys on mute when you were talking to them? Was it on mute on Zoom? Yeah. Did they not hear?
Maybe. Just not going to say anything. So we told them this. We showed. I think we estimated that in a kind of a seller's market situation, that the rescission period or cooling off could actually add, I can't remember what it was, if there's supply side effects, like 2% to price growth. Like it's not enormous, but it doesn't help, right? Because you're just adding demand essentially. If I can make all of these offers, that's with costless offers. I think so. Now there's a small fee, but I don't know. It clearly doesn't. We did a bunch of international research. It's not very good data on how effective any of these things are. I think the best quote I saw was basically like, at best, it's just insignificant.
Yeah,
it just doesn't do anything.
It's a big waste of time.
Well, it's just some extra paperwork for Steve and everybody else selling real estate in BC.
Extra paperwork.
Yeah. Last question here, and then we'll let you go. We've discussed this on the podcast before. Steve's got 2 young girls. I've got a 1-year-old boy, and we've talked with people about like, what are the chances our kids can ever afford to buy real estate in the cities that we live in? Is that something that you've thought of, or discussions you've had with your kids? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Discussions with kids. You have teenagers, so they don't actually speak to you once they're like 16 years old. At least mine don't. It's a huge worry. In BC, if you look at demographic projections, by I think 2040 or over kind of like the next 10 to 15 years, BC is going to have more people in their 30s than at any time in the past 50 years, right? And 30-year-olds really need housing, and we don't make enough of it. So especially in a city like Vancouver, where we have serious zoning issues, where we have much of the land that's very close to the city is zoned for single-family homes, and so that land is really expensive, so no surprise they put big mansions on it because that's the best use of that land. So as long as we're not going to fix that, it's going to be really hard to build more housing that's anything close to affordable. Even an apartment in Vancouver, in the city of Vancouver, is going to be like $700,000-$800,000. So it's not affordable in any way, for most people. So if you're just starting out as a kid, if you're in your late 20s or something, first job, like it's going to be really difficult to buy something, and we have no rental housing either. So this is something we needed to fix 10 years ago. Instead, we concentrated the entire past decade on how we could reduce demand, and it's really hard to fight demographics, but that's what we did instead of fixing all of our supply problems. And now, thankfully, everyone seems to be on the same page about supply, but you can't fix supply overnight. Supply takes a really long time to fix, and there's going to be big fights with municipalities over it. So over the next 10 years, hopefully we make some progress and we can radically increase the amount we're building and the types of homes we're building. But I think it's going to be very, very difficult for a lot of people, young people right now, to certainly buy the types of home maybe they grew up in. Like my kids are in a single family home that we bought in 2012. Like, it's going to be pretty tough for them to replicate that in their future.
Yeah. I mean, in my market and where you guys are, like, if it's your first home, that's been out of question for the last 20 years. Like, you're buying a starter something, basically a condo, It's like, I think condos do so well in Toronto and Vancouver because that's your only option. It's like,
Right.
you don't buy because you love it. You buy because that's the one thing in your price bracket, right?
And more that's going to be the case. I mean, we're thankfully, I guess, not really building a lot of single family homes anymore, at least in the Lower Mainland. But like, we need to build a lot more apartments too, because there's that millennials are all kind of in their household forming years now, and there's a lot of them. 27% of the population, the highest, the largest age cohort in BC. They got to go somewhere. And we have the wealth transfer situation here, where we have a lot of very rich baby boomers who are the other largest cohort. I think it's like 25% or something. And they've, if you're fortunate enough to have parents or grandparents that will just give you money, that's been one of the ways that we've been funding a lot of the down payment hurdle in BC, which is pretty high. But it's going to be tough.
Yeah. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. Honestly, I'm leaving this feeling better about the economy and the market.
That is not the way most people leave a conversation, not just with me, but with any economist. We're usually pretty pessimistic. So thankfully, I talk to realtors a lot who tend to be super optimistic. Maybe it's rubbing off on me.
Yeah. Steve, final thoughts?
I do have a final thought, and it's going back to the one kind of ridiculous question I have left from earlier. We didn't see a couple years ago the pandemic coming. Last year, we didn't see conflict in Europe coming. Put on your tinfoil hat or put on your or get out your crystal ball or whatever. If you had to guess, just for fun, what do we not see coming this year?
Just for fun. What would be the most, what crisis might befall us?
Basically, yeah.
I mean, not even crisis, just even if it's to the positive, right? Do you think
I was gonna say
something?
If there's any justice in the world, just a meteor comes and takes us all out. Don't have to worry about any of this. So that'd be my number one. A good thing, I don't know. I guess a best case scenario is that the economy doesn't fall into a recession. Inflation miraculously comes back down to maybe below 2%. Bank of Canada cuts rates. Nobody loses their job. And we were kind of back on the kind of course we thought we would be on, in the sort of, if you remember people talking about the next roaring 20s, where everyone's flush with cash and we're all out spending. It's like record scratch.
That lasted 2 months.
Yeah, exactly. So one, meteor of death. 2, soft landing for the economy. And
all right, BC real estate economist says we are going to get hit by asteroid.
There you go.
Can we make that the title of this video?
You can do whatever you want. Yeah, sure.
My prediction is that the Leafs are going to win a playoff round, because I just don't expect it to happen. So that's going to be mine.
Do you know who the only people more wrong than economists usually are? Is Tom about the Leafs.
Brendon, if anyone wants to, I don't know how back and forth you are or your availability to the public or anyone listening to this, but if anyone has a question for you or wants to see, the reports that you put out, what's the best place for them to go?
You can go to our website. It's bcrea.bc.ca. Click on economics. All of our stuff is there. You can click on to get stuff sent to you right to your inbox every time we release something. So that's probably the best way to do it.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Pleasure.
Oh, subscribe, all that stuff.